While ambition initially propels advancement, it eventually loses its capacity to guide meaningful action, not because life has become difficult, not because opportunity has disappeared, and not because effort suddenly feels impossible. You still function. You still complete what needs to be done. You still meet obligations and respond when required. What changes is the internal pressure behind those actions. The drive that once pushed you forward weakens, not in a dramatic collapse, but in a gradual thinning. Ambition no longer gathers momentum the way it once did. The idea of getting ahead, standing out, or progressing towards something larger loses its emotional charge. At first, this can be easy to overlook. You assume you are tired. You attribute it to having achieved enough already. You tell yourself it is a temporary low. But as time passes, the pattern becomes difficult to dismiss. You are no longer motivated by advancement. You no longer feel pulled toward the next level. You no longer experience the familiar tension that once accompanied the idea of falling behind. This absence does not feel like relief. It feels confusing, because ambition has never been just a preference. It has been an organizing force. It has structured time, effort, and self-image. It has answered the question of why you do what you do. When that answer fades, the psyche becomes unsettled. Many people respond to this shift with concern. They begin to question their discipline. They worry about losing their edge. They wonder whether they are becoming passive or unproductive. These concerns feel practical on the surface, but beneath them sits a deeper unease. Ambition has been closely tied to identity. To want more has been a way of locating yourself in the world. It has defined your direction, your standards, and your sense of value. When ambition weakens, identity loosens with it. This is why the loss of ambition can feel more threatening than the loss of pleasure. Pleasure fades quietly. Ambition collapses structurally. It removes the framework that once held effort together. You may notice this in how you relate to work. Tasks that once felt like steps towards something larger now feel self-contained. You complete them because they are there, not because they lead somewhere meaningful. There is no internal narrative about growth, trajectory, or future payoff. This shift can feel disorienting, because work has long been more than work. It has been proof of competence, proof of worth, proof of momentum. When work no longer serves those functions, it becomes strangely neutral. You may still care about doing things well. You may still take responsibilities seriously. But the idea of building towards something no longer excites or worries you. This neutrality is often mistaken for laziness. But laziness involves avoidance. What you are experiencing does not. You are not resisting work. You are simply no longer driven by ambition. That distinction matters. Ambition has always carried tension. It has created urgency. It has pressured the psyche with imagined futures and feared outcomes. It has framed effort as a means of securing position, safety, or recognition. When that pressure dissolves, effort loses its emotional charge. And without emotional charge, work feels flat, not meaningless, not oppressive, just flat. This flatness is uncomfortable because the psyche has been trained to associate intensity with importance. When effort no longer feels intense, it is assumed to be unimportant. But importance does not depend on intensity. Intensity depends on pressure. As ambition weakens, pressure recedes. And when pressure recedes, the nervous system does not immediately know how to interpret effort without it. You may notice yourself hesitating more around work-related decisions, not because you are unsure what to do, but because the old incentives no longer apply. You no longer feel compelled to prove yourself. You no longer feel driven to outperform others. You no longer feel anxious about not doing enough. This absence can feel risky, because ambition once acted as a safeguard. It ensured that you stayed active, visible, and relevant. Without it, the psyche worries about stagnation. This worry is rarely expressed clearly. It appears instead as subtle anxiety, a sense that something important has gone quiet, a fear that momentum has been lost, a concern that life may begin to shrink. These fears are understandable. Ambition has been presented as necessary for survival, growth, and contribution. Its absence is often framed as decline. But this framing assumes that ambition is the only way effort can be organized. It is not. What is dissolving here is not the capacity to work. It is the need to be driven. This distinction is rarely recognized at first, because drive has always been the visible part of effort. It has been the energy that pushed you forward, that made work feel purposeful, that gave direction to time. When drive disappears, it feels as though the engine has stopped. But engines are not the only way systems move. At this stage, work often becomes quieter. You complete tasks without anticipation. You meet responsibilities without internal resistance. You contribute without attaching meaning to contribution. This can feel unsettling because meaning has long been tied to ambition. To work without ambition can feel pointless. But pointlessness implies absence of value. What you are experiencing is absence of inflation. Earlier, work was inflated by imagined futures, by hopes of becoming something, by fears of becoming nothing. When those projections dissolve, work returns to its literal form. Something needs doing. You do it. There is no story attached. This lack of story is often mistaken for disengagement. But disengagement involves withdrawal. What is happening here involves simplification. The psyche is no longer investing work with identity. This simplification is not voluntary. It happens as a consequence of earlier integration. After identity has loosened in other areas of life, ambition can no longer perform its old role. It cannot convincingly promise transformation, fulfillment, or self-definition. As a result, it loses authority. This loss of authority does not arrive with clarity. It arrives with silence. The inner voice that once urged you forward grows quiet. It no longer argues. It no longer motivates. It simply stops insisting. This silence can feel alarming, because without internal insistence, effort feels optional. And optional effort feels dangerous in a world that equates worth with productivity. You may notice yourself becoming more sensitive to external pressure. Deadlines still matter. Consequences still exist. But they no longer provoke the same internal response. You comply without internal drama. You resist without guilt. You choose without anxiety. This change can feel destabilizing because it removes familiar emotional feedback. Previously, anxiety signaled importance. Urgency signaled value. Pressure signaled necessity. Without these signals, the psyche feels unsure how to evaluate what matters. This uncertainty often leads to overthinking. You may find yourself analyzing your relationship to work, questioning whether you care enough, wondering whether something has gone wrong, comparing yourself to others who still seem driven. These comparisons tend to increase unease because they assume that ambition is a universal requirement. But ambition is not universal. It is developmental. At certain stages of life, ambition plays a necessary role. It organizes effort, builds capacity, and establishes independence. But it is not meant to govern the psyche indefinitely. When its function is complete, it recedes. Not dramatically, not ceremonially, but quietly. This quiet recession is often mistaken for failure. But failure involves inability. What you are experiencing involves reorientation. The psyche is withdrawing energy from a mode of functioning that no longer fits. This withdrawal does not mean work will disappear. It means work will change its meaning. At this stage, many people attempt to revive ambition deliberately. They set new goals. They seek external incentives. They try to reignite the familiar drive. These efforts often feel hollow. The psyche does not respond with the same urgency. The old tension does not return. This resistance is not laziness. It is refusal, not a conscious refusal, but a structural one. The psyche no longer consents to be organized by striving. This consent has quietly been withdrawn, and without it, ambition cannot operate. This does not yet feel like freedom. It feels like uncertainty, because without ambition, the question of why you work becomes harder to answer. And without a clear answer, effort can feel exposed. This exposure is uncomfortable, because it reveals how much work was previously justified by future-oriented fantasies. Without those fantasies, work stands alone. It must justify itself through adequacy rather than aspiration. This is a difficult adjustment, because aspiration has been the primary narrative around work. When aspiration fades, the psyche must confront work as it actually is, not a path, not a ladder, but a series of necessary actions. This confrontation is not depressing. It is sobering. Sobriety often feels like loss at first, because it removes intoxication. Ambition has always been intoxicating. It promised transformation, progress, and significance. It created momentum even when reality was uncertain. Without that intoxication, work feels clearer. But clarity is not always comfortable, because clarity reveals that much of what drove you is not required for life to continue. This realization can be destabilizing, because it raises a question the psyche is not yet ready to answer. If ambition is gone, what organizes work now? That question does not need to be resolved immediately. At this stage, it is enough to notice what has changed. The drive to achieve is quieted. Work continues, but without inflation. Effort remains, but without self-definition. This is not collapse. It is transition. And transitions often feel empty before they feel stable. What comes next is not the restoration of ambition, but a different relationship to work, one that does not rely on striving to justify effort. That shift does not arrive as insight. It arrives as practice, quietly, without announcement, and without the drama ambition once provided. Once the initial shock of ambitions disappear and settles, the psyche begins to search for meaning in the change. This search is rarely conscious at first. It emerges as unease, as low-level anxiety, as a persistent sense that something essential has gone missing. Because ambition has been present for so long, its absence feels unnatural. The psyche assumes that effort without drive must be unstable, unsustainable, or wrong. This assumption shapes the interpretations that follow. The most common misinterpretation is laziness. When ambition fades, the individual often worries that they are becoming idle or undisciplined. They monitor their output more closely. They compare themselves to earlier versions of themselves. They notice the absence of inner pressure and conclude that something has weakened. But laziness has a specific psychological structure. It involves avoidance. It involves resistance to engagement. It involves a desire to escape obligation. What is happening here does not resemble avoidance. You are not trying to avoid work. You are not withdrawing from responsibility. You are not resisting effort. Work continues. What has changed is the emotional force behind it. Ambition has always supplied that force by projecting the self into the future. It promised that effort now would result in elevation later. Status, recognition, security, or self-worth were imagined outcomes that justified present strain. When that projection loses credibility, ambition loses leverage. This does not mean the psyche no longer values work. It means work no longer needs to justify identity. Another common misinterpretation is apathy. Apathy implies indifference. It suggests that nothing matters enough to provoke response. It involves emotional disengagement from outcomes. But what you are experiencing lacks that indifference. You still care whether things are done properly. You still respond to what is required. You still feel irritation when something is careless or unnecessary. Apathy flattens engagement. What you are experiencing refines it. The refinement is subtle, and because it is subtle, it is often misread. Ambition has always exaggerated stakes. It turned tasks into symbols. A project was not just a project. It was a step forward or backward in life. Success was not just completion. It was confirmation of worth. Failure was not just an error. It was a threat to identity. When ambition collapses, the symbolic layer dissolves. Tasks return to their literal meaning. Something needs to be done. You do it. It ends. There is no surplus meaning attached. This reduction can feel disorienting because it removes the emotional scaffolding that once made work feel important. But importance and inflation are not the same. Inflation made work feel urgent. Importance makes work necessary. Ambition thrived on inflation. It amplified effort by tying it to imagined futures and feared outcomes. It created internal pressure by suggesting that not striving would lead to loss of status, security, or self-definition. When earlier stages of psychological development are underway, this pressure is adaptive. It pushes the individual into competence. It builds structure. It establishes a place in the world. But ambition is not designed to be permanent. As integration deepens, the psyche no longer needs to be coerced into functioning. It no longer requires imagined futures to justify present action. This is where ambition begins to collapse. Not because the individual has failed, but because the function ambitions serve has been fulfilled. This is rarely recognized at first. Instead, the psyche assumes something has gone wrong. Because ambition has been culturally framed as the engine of productivity, its absence is interpreted as a threat to survival. The individual worries that without ambition, they will stagnate, fall behind, or become irrelevant. These fears feel practical, but they are rooted in a narrow understanding of motivation. Motivation driven by ambition relies on tension. It requires dissatisfaction with the present. It feeds on the belief that something essential lies ahead and must be reached. When dissatisfaction dissolves, ambition has nothing to feed on. This does not eliminate motivation entirely. It eliminates a specific form of motivation, striving-based motivation. Striving-based motivation depends on lack. It assumes that the present is insufficient and must be improved through effort. When the psyche no longer experiences itself as lacking, striving loses coherence. This is often misread as complacency. But complacency implies contentment that blocks engagement. What you are experiencing is not contentment. It is sufficiency. Sufficiency does not resist effort. It simply does not dramatize it. This difference is crucial. Earlier, effort felt charged because it was tied to becoming something. Now, effort feels neutral because becoming is no longer the organizing narrative. This neutrality is often unsettling. Because neutrality does not motivate. It does not push. It does not reward. It does not threaten. It simply allows. The psyche, accustomed to being driven by emotional force, feels uncertain in the absence of pressure. This uncertainty often leads to overinterpretation. The individual may begin to question whether they still belong in their work, whether their contribution still matters, whether they should make drastic changes to reintroduce purpose. But these questions arise too early. They assume that work must feel a certain way to be legitimate. That assumption is inherited, not intrinsic. Work does not need to feel aspirational to be functional. This becomes clearer when you examine what still remains intact. You still show up. You still complete tasks. You still respond to real-world demands. What has disappeared is the need to frame these actions as steps toward something larger. This disappearance feels like loss because the psyche has been conditioned to equate progress with meaning. But progress is not the only organizing principle available. There is also adequacy. Adequacy does not promise transformation. It does not inflate effort. It does not reward ambition. It simply asks whether something is done well enough to meet reality. This standard feels uninspiring to an ego accustomed to striving, but psychologically it is stabilizing. When ambition collapses, work often reorganizes itself around adequacy rather than advancement. This reorganization is quiet. There is no announcement, no insight, no sense of arrival. It shows up as a shift in attention. You focus more on what is actually required and less on what it represents. You notice details without attaching identity to them. You complete tasks without imagining how they position you. This can feel anticlimactic. But anticlimax is not failure. It is a removal of exaggeration. Ambition exaggerated effort by loading it with meaning. Without that exaggeration, effort returns to scale. This return to scale is often interpreted as loss because the psyche misses the stimulation that exaggeration provided. But stimulation is not the same as engagement. Stimulation excites. Engagement involves contact. When ambition fades, stimulation decreases. Engagement remains. This distinction becomes clearer over time. You may notice that you are less reactive to outcomes. Success does not elevate you. Failure does not destabilize you. You correct errors without self-reproach. You complete successes without self-congratulation. This emotional leveling is often misread as indifference, but indifference avoids contact. What you are experiencing maintains contact without inflation. This is psychologically significant because it indicates that work is no longer serving identity. Earlier, work was a mirror. It reflected back who you were becoming. Without that reflection, identity had to be sourced elsewhere. Now, work no longer mirrors identity. It stands on its own. This separation can feel like alienation at first, because the psyche has long relied on work to provide self-definition. Without that function, work feels exposed. It is just work. This exposure is uncomfortable because it strips away the narrative that made effort feel heroic. But heroism was never the point. Heroism compensated for insecurity. When insecurity resolves, heroism becomes unnecessary. This is why attempts to revive ambition often fail. The psyche resists being reinflated, not because effort is unwelcome, but because exaggeration no longer fits. This resistance is often mistaken for lack of drive. But drive has not vanished. It has changed its source. Instead of arising from imagined futures, movement begins to arise from immediate necessity. Something needs doing. You do it. There is no internal negotiation. This form of motivation feels less powerful because it lacks drama. But drama was never required for functioning. It was required for self-justification. As ambition collapses, the psyche begins to see how much effort was previously spent justifying effort. Without that need, energy is conserved. This conservation can feel like slowing down, but slowing down is not stopping. It is recalibration. The nervous system adjusts to operating without constant arousal. Effort no longer triggers adrenaline. Work no longer activates threat or reward systems to the same degree. This physiological shift often goes unnoticed, but it changes how work feels. Effort becomes quieter. Time feels less pressured. Outcomes feel less charged. This quiet can feel dangerous in environments that equate urgency with importance. But urgency was never a reliable indicator of necessity. It was an indicator of fear. Fear of falling behind. Fear of being nothing. Fear of not matching. As these fears loosen, urgency loses relevance. What remains is a simpler relationship with work. You do what is required because it is required, not because it promises identity, not because it secures worth, not because it proves anything. This simplicity does not arrive with clarity. It arrives with ambiguity, because the psyche is still adjusting to functioning without ambition. At this stage, it is common to oscillate. Some days feel steady, others feel uncertain. There may be moments where the absence of ambition feels relieving, followed by moments where it feels unsettling. This oscillation is not regression. It is adjustment. The psyche is learning how to operate without an organizing force it relied on for a long time. This learning process is uneven, but it is not pathological. It is developmental. Ambition collapses not because work is no longer meaningful, but because meaning no longer needs to be manufactured through striving. Work continues, but its psychological role has changed. It no longer defines who you are, and that change, while destabilizing at first, opens the possibility for a more grounded relationship with effort. That relationship does not announce itself yet. It emerges gradually, through repetition, through adequacy, through contact with reality rather than projection. This emergence does not feel like progress. It feels like settling. And settling is often mistaken for stagnation. But stagnation involves inertia. What you are experiencing involves reorganization. The psyche is redistributing energy away from striving and toward stability. This redistribution is quiet, but it is not empty. It is preparing the ground for a different way of working, one that does not rely on ambition to justify effort. That way does not restore excitement. It restores coherence. And coherence, while less dramatic, is far more sustainable. What remains now is not the question of how to regain ambition, but whether ambition is still needed at all. That question does not demand an answer yet. It simply signals that the old framework has dissolved, and something else is slowly taking its place. As time passes, the absence of ambition begins to register differently. What initially felt like a loss of direction slowly reveals itself as a change in orientation. The psyche, having withdrawn energy from striving, does not remain empty. It begins, almost imperceptibly, to reorganize around a different principle. This principle does not announce itself with clarity or confidence. It emerges quietly through repeated contact with ordinary tasks. At first, the individual may not notice the shift at all. Work continues. Responsibilities remain. Life still places demands. But something in how these demands are met has changed. Previously, work was evaluated through projection. Each task was measured against what it might lead to, what it might secure, or what it might prove. Effort was rarely confined to the present moment. It was stretched forward into imagined futures. Now, that stretching has stopped. Tasks no longer point beyond themselves. They begin and end where they are. This change can feel anticlimactic because it removes the sense of trajectory that ambition once provided. Without trajectory, effort feels exposed. It no longer hides behind promise or potential. It stands on its own, unadorned. This exposure is uncomfortable at first, because without ambition, work cannot rely on fantasy to justify itself. It must justify itself through reality. That reality is often simple. Something needs to be done. It can be done adequately. It can be finished. There is no surplus meaning attached. This simplicity often feels disappointing, not because work is meaningless, but because the psyche has been accustomed to excess meaning. Ambition supplied that excess. It inflated effort by tying it to identity, future worth, and imagined outcomes. When ambition dissolves, that inflation collapses. What remains is proportion. Effort becomes proportionate to necessity. This proportionality changes how work is experienced. Earlier, work felt heavy because it carried the weight of becoming. Each action was a step toward a version of the self that did not yet exist. The present was tolerated because it was believed to lead somewhere else. Now, the present is no longer merely a bridge. It is where work happens. This shift alters the emotional texture of effort. You may notice that work feels lighter, but also less rewarding. Not because it is unpleasant, but because it no longer provides psychological payoff. There is no inner narrative reinforcing the sense that something important is being built. This absence can feel disorienting, because the psyche has long relied on work to provide reassurance. Reassurance that you are moving, that you are improving, that you are becoming someone. Without that reassurance, work feels incomplete. But incomplete according to what standard? The standard that ambition imposed. That standard assumed that effort must lead somewhere meaningful beyond itself. When that assumption dissolves, effort no longer needs to lead anywhere. It needs only to be sufficient. The sufficiency is difficult to accept at first, because sufficiency does not flatter the ego. It does not promise distinction. It does not suggest progress. It does not offer recognition. It simply meets reality where it is. As this becomes clearer, the psyche begins to notice something unexpected. Despite the absence of ambition, work continues to happen. Tasks are completed. Problems are addressed. Responsibilities are met. Nothing collapses. This realization is subtle, but it carries weight, because it challenges a deeply ingrained belief that without ambition, nothing would move. That belief turns out to be inaccurate. Movement does not stop. It changes its source. Instead of arising from imagined futures, it arises from immediate contact with the present. Something is needed. You respond. There is no internal debate. This form of movement feels quieter because it lacks emotional force, but it is also more direct. It does not require persuasion or pressure. It is simply appropriate. Appropriateness begins to replace aspiration. This replacement is not chosen. It emerges naturally as the psyche adjusts. Appropriateness does not ask whether an action advances you. It asks whether an action fits the situation. This is a different evaluative framework, and one the psyche may not consciously recognize at first, but it becomes evident in behavior. You stop overextending effort. You stop adding unnecessary complexity. You stop investing energy where it is not required. Work becomes cleaner, not more impressive, not more ambitious. Cleaner. This cleanliness often goes unnoticed because it lacks drama, but it is a sign of reorganization. When ambition collapses, the psyche becomes less interested in excess. It no longer tolerates unnecessary effort. It no longer justifies overwork to imagine reward. This leads to a reduction in friction. not because work is easier, but because resistance has changed direction. Earlier, resistance was directed toward the present. You resisted what was in front of you because you were oriented towards something else. Now, resistance is directed toward excess. You resist doing more than is required. You resist inflating tasks with unnecessary meaning. This resistance is not conscious. It is structural. The psyche no longer invests energy where it does not belong. This shift often alters the pace of work. You may notice that you work more steadily, but with less urgency. Deadlines still exist, but they no longer provoke internal alarm. Consequences are acknowledged, but they do not dominate attention. This does not mean you are careless. It means fear is no longer organizing effort. Earlier, fear of falling behind was a powerful motivator. It kept ambition active. It ensured constant motion. Without that fear, ambition cannot operate. But fear was never a stable foundation for work. It produced effort, but at the cost of tension. As fear recedes, effort becomes more economical. You expend energy where it is needed and withhold it where it is not. This economy is often misinterpreted as disengagement, but disengagement involves withdrawal. What you are experiencing involves precision. Precision is less visible than striving. Striving announces itself. Precision does not. Precision simply functions. As this precision develops, another change becomes apparent. Work stops being central to identity. This does not mean work is unimportant. It means it no longer defines who you are. Earlier, work was intertwined with self-concept. Success and failure at work translated directly into self-evaluation. Achievement validated identity. Setbacks threatened it. Now, that translation has weakened. Work outcomes no longer dictate self-worth. This separation can feel unsettling because it removes a familiar feedback loop. Without work to tell you who you are, identity feels thinner. But thinner does not mean weaker. It means less entangled. This disentanglement reduces internal conflict. You no longer need to defend your work choices as reflections of your value. You no longer need to justify effort through aspiration. You simply do what is required. This simplicity does not produce excitement. It produces steadiness. Steadiness is often undervalued because it lacks emotional payoff. But psychologically, steadiness is significant. It indicates that the psyche is no longer dependent on external outcomes to regulate itself. This independence is quiet. It does not feel empowering. It does not feel liberating. It feels neutral. And neutrality can feel disappointing in a culture that celebrates passion. But passion often relies on imbalance. It amplifies certain aspects of experience at the expense of others. It creates peaks, but also troughs. Without ambition, these fluctuations soften. Work no longer produces emotional highs or lows. This leveling can feel like loss, but it is actually stabilization. Stabilization does not attract attention. It simply allows life to continue without disruption. As this becomes more familiar, the psyche begins to recognize that ambition was not the only way to care about work. Caring does not require striving. Caring can exist without pressure. You may notice that you still prefer certain tasks to be done well. You still experience irritation when something is careless or inefficient. You still notice when work is poorly handled. These reactions indicate that engagement remains. What is absent is the need to turn engagement into identity. This distinction becomes clearer over time. Work no longer feels like a measure of self. It feels like participation in reality. Participation does not require ambition. It requires presence. Presence is less stimulating than ambition, but it is more accurate. Presence responds to what is actually happening rather than to what is imagined. As ambition fades, imagination loosens its grip. Work is no longer a stage for imagined futures. It is an interaction with what is. This interaction often becomes more grounded. You are less likely to overpromise, less likely to overextend, less likely to overinvest emotionally. This grounding reduces disappointment, because disappointment arises when expectation exceeds reality. Without ambition, expectations are lower, not in a pessimistic sense, in a realistic one. This realism alters how satisfaction is experienced. Earlier, satisfaction was tied to achievement. It required surpassing a standard. Now, satisfaction is tied to adequacy. Adequacy does not thrill. It reassures. Reassurance does not produce excitement. It produces calm. Calm is often overlooked because it does not signal success. But psychologically, calm indicates that the psyche is no longer at odds with itself. As this calm settles, work begins to occupy a more proportionate place in life. It is no longer the axis around which everything turns. It is one domain among others. This redistribution can feel destabilizing because it alters priorities without clearly defining new ones. But this lack of definition is temporary. The psyche is still adjusting. At this stage, it is common to feel moments of drift, periods where work feels routine, where effort feels mechanical, where nothing feels particularly compelling. These moments are not failures. They are pauses. The psyche is no longer filling every space with ambition. It allows emptiness to exist. This emptiness is not void. It is unoccupied space. And unoccupied space allows new forms of organization to emerge. These forms are subtle. They do not take the shape of goals or aspirations. They take the shape of alignment. Alignment is not something you pursue. It is something you notice when resistance decreases, when work fits your capacity, when effort matches necessity, when actions feel neither forced nor avoided. This fitting does not produce excitement. It produces ease. Ease has long been undervalued, because ease does not prove anything. But ease indicates that the psyche is functioning without internal conflict. This is a significant shift. Earlier, work was often a battleground, between desire and obligation, between aspiration and fatigue, between fear and ambition. Without ambition, that battleground quiets, not because conflict is resolved, but because the stakes have changed. Work no longer carries existential weight. This reduction in weight allows work to be approached more directly. You do not need to psych yourself up. You do not need to justify your effort. You do not need to imagine rewards. You simply act. This simplicity does not feel meaningful in the old sense. But meaning has not disappeared. It has relocated. Meaning is no longer extracted from work. It is allowed to exist elsewhere. This relocation can feel unsettling because work has long been the primary container for meaning. Without that container, meaning feels diffuse. But diffusion is not absence. It is redistribution. As work releases its grip on identity, other aspects of life gain space. Attention spreads, not because work has diminished, but because it no longer dominates. This spread does not require intention. It happens naturally as ambition recedes. Over time, the fear that accompanied ambition's collapse begins to lose credibility. The fear that without ambition, nothing would hold together. But things do hold together, not through striving, through structure. Structure does not depend on ambition. It depends on coherence. Coherence emerges when the psyche is no longer divided between present demands and imagined futures. As this coherence develops, work feels less charged, but also less threatening. You no longer fear being left behind, because the idea of being ahead has lost relevance. This does not mean you stop caring. It means you stop competing with imagined versions of yourself. This competition has always been exhausting. Its absence frees energy, not for greater achievement, for stability. Stability is not dramatic, but it is sustainable. And sustainability becomes important when ambition is no longer fueling effort. Without ambition, work must rely on rhythm rather than drive. Rhythm emerges slowly, through repetition, through adequacy, through contact with reality. This rhythm is not imposed. It develops as the psyche finds its pace. This pace may be slower, or it may simply be less frantic. Either way, it feels different, and difference is often mistaken for decline. But decline involves loss of function. What you are experiencing involves change of function. Work is no longer about becoming. It is about participating. This participation does not need justification. It does not need ambition to validate it. It simply continues. When ambition collapses, work does not disappear. What disappears is the pressure to turn work into proof. What remains is effort without inflation, action without striving, and participation without self-definition. This change is quiet, and because it is quiet, it is often misunderstood, but it marks a shift from being driven to being grounded. If this reflects something you've been experiencing, you're welcome to subscribe to this channel for future explorations through the lens of Carl Jung of life and work after ambition loses its authority. You can also share this video with someone who feels unsettled by the loss of drive but hasn't found language for it yet. And if you'd like to continue the reflection, feel free to leave your thoughts or experience in the comments. Seeing how this shift unfolds across different lives often deepens the understanding for everyone.